The branching quest design and open world of the Fallout series is made for some massive games, which has always been a problem for the official guides. Almost every official guide has come up short, a trend that began right from the very start. The first guide was outsourced to Brady Games, and the layout had to be submitted months before launch so the printing could be completed on time. Unfortunately, the game was still going through major changes all the way up until the very end of development, resulting in a guide that's full of misinformation and unused ideas. Like where it mentions Decker being murdered by the children of the cathedral, a scene that doesn't exist. Or location-specific consequences to being knocked unconscious. Like having a weapon taken from your inventory if it happened in Junktown, outright being killed if you got knocked out in the Rad Scorpion caves, or being thrown in jail if the hub police knocked you out, and afterwards you could apparently break out of jail and be an escaped prisoner, who the cops would then try to kill, none of which happens in the final game. Even worse, the guide was only a little over 200 pages long, failing to cover much of the game at all. I don't think the team was satisfied, because after launch, Tim Kaine and Chris Taylor wrote their own walkthrough on a fan site. Designer Dave Hindy later stated the writers of the official guide never even played the game. It was so bad that when one fan asked if there was a guide, Dave told them to use fan walkthroughs instead. Unfortunately, fan walkthroughs weren't that much better at the time, and were often filled with misinformation and rumors. For example, a rumor of a secret island persisted for years after Fallout came out, despite the devs denying its existence multiple times. These issues encouraged the team to take matters into their own hands, creating the sequel's guide themselves, and luckily, lead designer Matthew Norton had already assisted in writing the guide for another Interplay production, Descent. Likely as a result, he also wrote Fallout 2's guide, receiving help from the designers and programmers. He reportedly spent around 1,000 hours creating the 350-page compendium, which, while admirable, was also a very questionable use of time for one of the game's two design leads. During development, Matt somehow managed to design companions like Sulik and Lenny, and factions like the Enclave on top of writing the guide. In many ways it's a fantastic guide, but art assets and system tweaks were being made all the way up until launch, and once again, the guide had to be sent out months in advance to be printed. Because of this, there are numerous discrepancies in the first edition, something that's even mentioned in the guide itself. They ended up fixing some of these mistakes in an errata post on the Cybex website, but even then, many mistakes remained. This is perhaps the best example of how they were actively making major changes all the way down to the last hours before the game went gold. To enter the Great Wanamingo Mine, the player needs to fight through a rat-infested building to reach an elevator. There's a nearby building that has no purpose in the final game, but the guide mentions you originally needed to repair a generator here to restore the elevator's power. The generator is still present behind a locked door, but it can't be repaired and the elevator is always functional. In Redding, there's a game where you can bet on fights between mole rats. The guide reveals death claws would later be used when the crowd got tired of mole rats, but this never happens. There is a graphic left over for it, but the Deathclaws were never set up or given names. On the bottom level of the Gecko power plant, there's a hallway that leads to a mysterious pit. The guide mentions you could climb down here once you lowered the crane in the reactor level, but it can't be lowered. Notably, there's a sprite for it being lowered and a sound effect for activating it. Broken Hills has a subplot where anti-mutant conspirators are trying to get rid of the ghouls and super mutants in town. The guide states this room serves as a storage area for the anti-mutant faction, but in the final game, it's just another cave area full of ants. In Sierra Army Depot, there's a room called the Automated Repair Bay. The guide reveals that repair bots were meant to travel to each level after you left, repairing the robots you had damaged. If you had a high science, luck, or perception skill, you could disable the robots and stop this from happening. It's unknown if they would have only healed damaged robots that remained alive, or if they would have resurrected dead ones too. But either way, it would have made the area much more dangerous. The image for Anna's locket uses a picture of a cut quest item from Fallout 1, and it appears completely different in-game. The backpack was an item in the first game that could be used to organize your items. It was an unintuitive, confusing item that perplexed many players. It appears in the guide, but was cut from the game entirely. Later, the backpack was kind of added to tactics, but only appears in the tutorial levels. It would finally make a triumphant return in '76, almost 20 years later. The bag item is also mentioned in the guide, but as far as I'm aware, it's only used a single time in the well in MODOK and can't be bought, despite there being a price for it in the guide. To make matters worse, many illustrations were completed and then later replaced. Some of these changes were minor, like the Pancore jackhammer and Magnum sprites being rotated, but in other cases there were major alterations. The G11E has a bipod, a different scope, and was considered a big gun, but would end up being governed by small guns in the final release. The Needler had a front sight and used Needler packs as ammo instead of Needler cartridges, while some weapons like the Gauss rifle are completely unrecognizable in the guide. The Mega Power Fist had a late name change, as it's called the Power Fist Spike Knuckles. Some guns like the Pulse Rifle are listed as having a burst mode, but they're missing in-game. Matt Norton later revealed the burst mode was dropped from some weapons after it went to print because they were overpowered. The standard shotgun also had a double barrel firing mode that increased range and dealt more damage, at the cost of additional AP and an extra shotgun shell. Stealth Boys gave the player a temporary stealth bonus in the first game, but it doesn't appear in the second, despite it being in the guide. Nightkin do appear in random encounters, but they're missing Stealth Boys, even though it was their defining trait in Fallout 1. The Stealth Boys visual effect does get used with Anna in the den. It even gets mentioned by the player when talking to her. The code for Stealth Boys is still present as well, all of which suggest it was cut relatively late for an unknown reason.
We didn't eat cheesy poofs, we'd be...
Cheesy Poofs are a miscellaneous item and an homage to South Park. They can't be used, but the guide mentions they were meant to heal 5 to 10 HP. Even more, it states they had an addiction effect, with each box reducing your intelligence and perception for 48 hours. In-game, they cost $5 instead of $50, which is still mentioned in the guide. Presumably they cut the price alongside actually being able to use them. The description for the Day Pass item implies it originally gave the player access to Vault City for 24 hours, then you'd have to buy another. In the final game, it can be used to access the settlement indefinitely. The Field Switch was an unused item in the first game that was related to the force fields in Mariposa military base. It was recycled for the sequel and still appears in the guide where it states, "This switch is used to shut down the air purifier in Broken Hill's uranium mine." However, the item isn't used and isn't needed to shut down the air purifier, making it the only item cut from both games. In Fallout 1's guide, it mentioned an item that couldn't be found called the electric motor. It actually appeared in the sequel in Navarro, and the guide states it could be used to repair the air purifier in Broken Hills. But the item has no purpose whatsoever in the final game. You can find and play with Tragic cards, a parody of Magic the Gathering. Originally, there was an addiction effect linked to playing it. If you were addicted and traveling on the map, your progress would be interrupted and you'd be given the message, "You feel a burning desire to open another box of Tragic cards." This would have decreased your perception and luck by 2, and reduced your intelligence by 1 for a week. Despite being cut, Woos and MODOK still mentions that Tragic is as addictive as Jet. There's a typo in the guide's description, but it seems to imply that having a deck of Magic cards could stave off the addiction effect. Tragic would be referenced one more time in New Vegas, though after the official partnership between Wizards of the Coast and Bethesda, I doubt we'll ever see another homage to this parody, unfortunately. Many players were confused about Jet addiction, as it required the player to find the Jet antidote item to cure. After launch, the developers considered changing it to a temporary addiction like other chems, but ended up leaving it as a permanent addiction. The guide reveals it originally functioned this way earlier in development, with its addiction effect only lasting 2 days originally. The Taiwanese version of the guide features a handful of cut items missing from the US edition, including the decomposing body and password paper items. Even though it was a significant improvement over the original guide, Fallout 2's version ended up having many of the same issues. failing to cover much of the game's content and containing a significant amount of outdated information. Regardless, it remains a fascinating look into what Almost was, as all of this was left on the cutting room floor.